Ruslan Aysin, political analyst and head of the media center Poistin, is joining us now. Hello, Ruslan.
Hello.
Good morning, colleagues.
Ruslan, how do you assess what is currently having the biggest influence on the opinions of Russians? Even the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who not only blessed the war, but has now even published a book. Yes, he has released a book where he justifies the war, practically claiming that this war is God given and all that. Or maybe it's more modern technologies, like how they're now almost calling Durov a terrorist in the Russian Federation, and even labeling Telegram as an enemy messenger. Even though not so long ago, people were defending that same Durov when he was detained in France. In your opinion, what is happening overall with the change in Kremlin policy, and how is it being perceived by Russian citizens?
First of all, you have to understand that Russia lives, so to speak, in two dimensions, what's called archaic modernity or archaeo-modern, right? Where part of the population looks up to Gundyayev and all those traditional values. It's actually a very small part, because according to fairly objective studies, only about 2% of people in Russia are truly religious. Those who actually go to church, who follow all the commandments and church traditions, there really aren't that many of them. It's important to understand clearly that everything else is just for show, like taking a picture with a candle for Instagram and things like that. And the majority, they're involved. Urban citizens are engaged in all these technological processes. They actively use messengers, obviously, both WhatsApp and Telegram, even though they're banned. The younger generation, of course, is unhappy with everything that's going on, but for now, they can't channel that dissatisfaction. And so the base of Putinism keeps shrinking, narrowing down to this core of, let's say, completely abnormal people. At one time, the well known thinker Haydar Jamal said that there's a mechanism of self destruction embedded in the Russian person. This is becoming clearly evident now. There is propaganda of violence and war, and this war itself is destroying this society, this country. No one from the West or Ukraine attacked us, but it's constantly explained that we need war because someone is supposedly about to attack us. And in the end, it turns out that Russia's only ally is North Korea, which I'm more than convinced will turn its back on Russia at the most critical moment, choosing instead, most likely, in favor of China, which is actually unhappy about the growing closeness between Pyongyang and Moscow. And in these difficult conditions, let's put it this way, almost pre revolutionary, on the verge of a social explosion, Putinism is really just treading water. It has no way out because it believes that stopping the war is the same as stopping a train that's rushing off a cliff. But continuing further, well, it's also not very clear what prospects that holds. And in reality, there aren't that many resources left. All this talk about mobilization, they could certainly carry it out, but it won't change the outcome of the war. Because, as was rightly said, people are basically being used as cannon fodder. And in a technological war, especially from Ukraine's side, which has already adapted and, well, synchronized its military actions with Russia's weaknesses, it means that it's not people who decide the outcome, but technology and the state of infrastructure. As we understand, Russia's infrastructure is in pretty poor shape. And basically, all of Russia, all of its territory, is like an open book, vulnerable. Today, there were strikes on wild berries in Penza and Udmurtia. That's almost 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. But as we can see, that's no obstacle for Ukrainian drones. It turns out that Putin has invited the war inside Russia. In fact, he is the real destroyer of Russia. No matter how much they scream that the West or someone else wants to destroy Russia, but I think that, more than anyone, it's Putin and his KGB clique who are doing the most in this regard.
Ruslan, what do you think about these attacks on wild berries, these tearful appeals, the videos that are popping up online showing that business is stopped, everything is destroyed, and packages have burned? We can even see what burned and to what extent. Obviously, now even the body armor has burned, and the FPV drones that were also being sold on this platform, this marketplace, which were then sent to the front, they've burned too. But these Russian entrepreneurs who are complaining, do they connect the fact that their businesses died to Putin starting the war in Ukraine? Do they understand that these things are connected?
They do understand. But again, we run into this ambivalence, this duality. On the one hand, business people are, of course, unhappy with Putinism because under Putin, their lives have gotten worse and worse, and they'd like to change things somehow. But on the other hand, this archaic model that sits in the collective unconscious of Russians dictates to them the need to complain to the Tsar. The boyars are bad, so let's complain to the Tsar. Get down on our knees, and he'll take pity on us. He'll do something. But he is the Tsar, after all. This duality is striking in a way. After all, it's obvious that appealing to the person who started this war himself, who is glad that people are dying, makes no sense. Just recently, he commented on the so called special military operation and, with a smirk, said he didn't know what we would do after it ends. It would be boring for us. Well, the person who treats war like that, with such a smirk, obviously can't be guided by any principles of compassion, mercy, or a merciful approach. That is exactly why all this constant complaining and these grievances from businessmen come across as incredibly unprofessional and weak, because Putin is clearly not the kind of person who would ever show them any kind of mercy or compassion. But the fact that this wave of complaints and grievances will keep growing reminds me of what happened in 1905 during the so called First Russian Revolution on January 9th, when ordinary people, peasants, and others, led by Father Gapon, went to the emperor with icons seeking his protection. And what did the guards do? What did the secret police do? They simply shot those people who were going to the Tsar, their little father, to ask for help. That's how this whole period of revolutionary turmoil began, which 12 years later led to the collapse and dismantling of the Russian Empire. Here, most likely, the same kind of discontent is building up, right? But for now, the line hasn't been crossed yet. People still believe that the Tsar, the little father, can change something. But when they start shooting people, apparently that's when it will become clear that the Tsar is neither our father nor our ruler, but a scoundrel, a bastard, and a child killer, just like it was with Nicholas II.
So, what do you think motivates the subsequent actions of the servicemen? Russian soldiers who, after being exchanged, were sent back to the front are increasingly surrendering and being taken prisoner again. This was reported by the Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. According to their data, there are now already about 20 Russian army soldiers in Ukrainian captivity who surrendered again to Ukraine's defense forces after being exchanged. The headquarters drew attention to the differences in how Ukraine and Russia treat their servicemen. Ukrainian defenders, upon returning from captivity, have the legal right to resign at their own request, while the Russian command sends its soldiers back to the front line after an exchange. And this probably also indicates that there aren't enough people for the war. How do you assess the situation?
In Russia, everyone is treated literally like slaves, like serfs. Again, if we use the rhetoric from pre revolutionary times, and servicemen are considered the same kind of slaves because they have no rights at all, no matter how much the propaganda screams otherwise. If a person ends up in the service, if they're mobilized, that's it. They'll be there practically until the very end. In other words, until he's killed, the system will keep tossing him back and forth like a washing machine. And that's exactly what's happening. So they're exchanged, they're not demobilized, they're thrown back in again, right? And they surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces because they know perfectly well that they're treated better there than in the Russian army. After all, there's a huge amount of video evidence showing them being beaten, raped in some places, tortured, tied to trees, beaten with sticks. But as they say, that's only half the story. The most important thing is that they're thrown into meat grinder assaults. In other words, they're forced to march to certain death. Naturally, like any person, their most basic instinct of self preservation kicks in. They surrender because, in that case, their lives are guaranteed. They have the right to live if they are captured by Ukraine. In the ranks of the Russian army, they don't have that right to life. As Goethe said, they only have the right to die, which can't be taken away. They just keep throwing them in over and over. And in fact, this is proof that this is an absolutely inhumane regime because it treats not only Ukrainians this way, but its own citizens as well. Essentially, this is truly serf like lawlessness. Once you get caught in these gears, just like in the Russian Empire, you had to serve for 25 years. Over those 25 years, well, about 80% of people most likely died or were left disabled. Here, it's exactly the same methodology.
Roman, let's discuss this further. Let's continue talking about mobilization. The Kremlin is luring contract soldiers into the war with record high payouts at the expense of impoverished regions, though that's exactly what they're doing. This is reported by the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, which clarifies that this is happening against the backdrop of a deepening crisis in regional budgets. For example, in one of the less affluent districts of the Russian Federation, in County Monsix, the Kremlin requires a payment of 4 million rubles for signing a contract with the Ministry of Defense, which is more than $50,000. Due to the lack of people willing to go to war, some regions have even introduced rewards for recruiters. However, against the backdrop of huge losses, the flow of volunteers is decreasing. This is also noted by the Centers for Countering Disinformation. At the same time, there is also this kind of analytical note. I'd like to share with you that a new mobilization won't save Russia from defeat, but it will drag out the war. What do you think these freshly mobilized people can do to help Putin's advances? It's just a replenishment of the pack that will be trampling over these square kilometers. It's a meat grinder, an attempt to carry out a purge of Russian society itself. What does this mobilization mean for Putin?
Well, first of all, Putin isn't a military man. Secondly, Putin lives
Kojidu.
by the narratives of the last century. And he thinks that the more people we call up, just like it was before, in World War I and World War II, with armies of millions, he thinks that these million strong armies, so to speak, decide the outcome of the war. That's how he thinks. And this way of thinking directly influences his decision making because apparently no one can contradict him. He believes, well, now we'll throw in the regiments and Ukraine will retreat. We'll push here now and that's it. Ukraine will collapse. That's how he reasons. That's why, as they say, the order was given to move west. And that's how this whole mechanism starts up, right? With both the carrot and the stick, they force and find money and make these regions, which really do have a record budget deficit, comply. That is, they cut and sequester all the social, educational, and cultural programs. Everything for the front, everything for the war. But this doesn't solve the problem at all. Experts have already explained this hundreds of times. Because even the Russian state doesn't have, so to speak, any equipment or weapons for these people. They won't even be able, to be perfectly honest, to approach or even get anywhere close to the front line because Ukrainian forces strike back consistently. There are drone systems there, and of course, reconnaissance is monitoring all of this pretty well. And in general, it's been technologically proven for a long time that basically all the access routes are monitored and within firing range. So it's not really clear why this is being done. Yeah, maybe it's just a stroke Putin's ego. See, we managed to mobilize another 500,000, but Ukraine can't. And then he'll smirk again. So that's basically the whole Putin model, and that's what it's all about.